Welcome to Trench Diaries. Omaha Beach. Part 2. Unteroffizier Henrik Naube. The cessation of the noise and blast waves came as a great relief, as you might imagine. My ears were ringing and I had blood on my face and on my eyes. We knew that the halt in the shelling meant that the landing must be imminent, and so we washed our eyes with water from our canteens, slid away the metal covers, and we slowly emerged from the bottom of the trenches. One by one, our men put their heads up over the lip of the trench they were in or over the parapet. I lifted the MG-42 back up and positioned it in the firing slit. I remembered that my father had told me many times that he did this as a machine gunner at the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. He and his comrades hid deep in their dugouts with their guns and then emerged to fix their guns in place again before the British attacked. Now here I was, doing the same thing. In the time that we had been under cover, the ships and boats of the attackers had come very close to the shore, and now we could see vessels which I would have called invasion barges, but later I learned were landing craft. I did not yet know what nationality these troops were. There were very many of these landing craft approaching the beach. There were at least 10 directly approaching me, coming through the initial swells of the waves off the beach. They were about 1 kilometer from my position. But all along the beach, we could see more of these craft approaching. The sea was absolutely alive with these vessels, which all seemed to be the same design and color. Behind them, there were small warships and all manner of other ships covering the sea. The sea was completely covered with this huge collection of vessels. You might be curious as to what went through my mind, seeing this force approaching. Honestly, I don't recall having any conscious thought or emotion other than anxiety that my gun might have been damaged in the shelling. I fired off a 1-second burst to test it. The other MG crew shouted at me to hold fire and remember our orders. I shouted at them to test their gun too, which they then did. I could hear similar short bursts up and down the cliffs, as the survivors of the shelling all quickly tested their machine guns. Then, our heavier guns opened fire. These were 88mm pack guns sighted in concrete positions further along the cliffs. There were 3 guns in our area, but only 2 fired, I assume because the other one was destroyed. These 88mm gunners were very accurate and shot into the landing craft straight through the tall vertical bow. They fired high explosive shells and they pierced the bow and exploded inside. I saw one of the landing craft approaching my location being hit in this way. The 88mm shell detonated behind the bow, which I then realized was a ramp. This ramp was thrown up into the air. Inside the craft I could see a large number of troops who had been injured in the explosion, surrounded by men who were still able-bodied. They were clambering and scrabbling over each other because the craft began to tip forward as water entered the now open bow. I saw then from the shape of their helmets that these were Americans. The 88mm gunners fired another shot into the mass of men, and this threw several of them out of the craft and into the water. The whole craft began to sink from the bow, which made the stern lift into the air. This motion tipped the men into the sea immediately. Wounded or otherwise, they all slid down the inside of the craft and into the water, as its stern rose. Such events were being repeated all along the beach, as these craft were hit or made to sink or in some cases set on fire. At that point the warships behind them began to fire onto the beach to suppress our artillery, which had the intended effect. Once again we began to keep our heads down and our 88mm guns stopped firing. But I continued to look through the slit of the parapet, and in that way I could see that, despite the losses, these landing craft were starting to lower their ramp doors and the men inside were starting to emerge and enter the water. The manner of the men's exit from the landing craft was not rushed. It was orderly. Very orderly. The craft were stopping at a point where the water was about chest or neck height. The men were running down the ramps and stepping into the water, holding their guns, plunging down and then bobbing up again with the sea up to their shoulders or chests. In most cases the men tried to advance in the water one behind the other, with each man holding the backpack of the man in front. It was as if they were conducting a drill or an exercise. As the last man stepped off the ramp, the craft would reverse, close its bow door, and more craft would approach the beach around it. The discipline and the skill in the way the craft were handled was impressive. And so the first of these lines of men began to trudge towards me. That is the only word I can use. They walked slowly and deliberately. They advanced in this way into shallower water, and the waves came to their chests and then their waists. That is when we opened fire on them, as our orders stated. Exactly as we had planned, I started firing my MG-42. These troops were about 400 meters away from us. I did not sight on them individually at first, but I began firing and I swept the gun from left to right along the beach. This knocked down the first few men in each line. You must remember that the MG-42 was so powerful that the bullets would often pass through the human body and hit whatever was behind. So it was that many of these men were hit by a bullet which had already passed through a man in front, or even two men in front. After that, I aimed more selectively, to conserve ammunition. I fired short bursts at small groups of men and hit them that way. The Americans began to run, wade or stagger forwards, trying to get out of the water and onto the sand itself. They still moved quite slowly, and because of that and the close range they were easy targets to hit. In some cases, they tried to remain in the water up to their necks, perhaps hoping to be less conspicuous. I did not fire at those men, because they showed no signs of advancing. In other cases, the troops tried to take shelter behind the anti-tank devices on the beach, which were triangles of girders sticking up from the sand. But those devices were too narrow to give any real protection though, and those men were also hit. There were other troops who I could see removing their backpacks and equipment and running onto the sand, attempting to sprint up the beach towards the sea wall. I paid particular attention to these men, of course, and made sure that none of them advanced beyond a few paces. Our other machine gun was operating in the same way as me, and between us we held back any Americans who tried to advance onto the sand in front of us. I also fired along the beach at other troops who were coming ashore further down the sand. Throughout this time we were being shelled intermittently by the warships, and there were boats behind the landing craft which were firing multiple rockets at us in the dunes. These rockets made huge explosions, but they were falling short of our position. At the same time, one of our 88mm guns began firing again and sank several more landing craft. The whole zone of the sea in front of us was now clogged with these craft, and the ones that had deployed their soldiers were colliding with the burning or drifting ones that had been hit. I am honestly unsure how many troops I killed. I can say that the shallow part of the sea immediately in front of us was full of bodies, probably at least 100. This amount was repeated up and down the beach in front of the other gun positions. The tide was starting to come in and these bodies were rolling and swaying with the movement of the water, and there were such things as helmets, rifles and equipment floating and rolling with them. After the initial burst of energy and determination that I felt when the attack started, I began to feel pity for these men. They kept arriving in landing craft. The craft would deploy them in the shallows and they would walk towards us through the water in the same way as the first set of troops. We fired at them in the same way, causing the same deaths and injuries. My loader was moved by this and he shook his head, saying that the Americans should not sacrifice their men in this way. I mentioned before that my father was at the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. At the Somme, it is said that some German machine gunners shouted at the advancing British to save themselves and retreat. There was no such communication from our men to the Americans, at least I am not aware. The only time we stopped firing was when the MG barrel began to overheat and the action showed signs of misfiring. We did not want to risk the gun breaking down, so we took it down to let it cool off. We then took up our rifles and used them, aiming at the Americans coming out of the water. This meant exposing our heads and arms above the parapet, and it was only at this point that I noticed we received the first shots aimed at us by the Americans themselves. They did not fire at us before this. Perhaps they did, but I did not notice anything like it before this point in time. The sand had various ridges in it from the shelling, and there was some natural undulation in the ground, especially a low ridge of shingle up against the sea wall. Some of the Americans had managed to take cover in these places and were firing sporadically from there. Their warships ceased their shelling at this point. I suppose because they were observing the beach and expected the combat to be at close quarters now. They began to shell behind us, blowing up the zone behind our cliffs. But the Americans who had taken advantage of the shingle ridge found it impossible to move out of them, as we fired on them as soon as they emerged. At the same time, the tide was coming in fully, so there was less and less space available on the sand for men to find cover at all. This meant that the soldiers arriving behind them had almost no available cover, and so the killing began again. We used our machine gun again from this point on. There was a moment when I thought the Americans might be forced to withdraw from the beach and that we might have defeated the invasion. I remember that one of the landing craft came close to the shallows and whoever was in charge of it seemed to hesitate. The craft slowed and steered carefully between other craft and the obstacles, as if selecting a place to land, but it did not make a final approach. Then it turned away, making a maneuver as if it was trying to turn around and leave the scene. I could hardly blame the man in charge for that. To see the situation of such carnage on the sand, with all the bodies jumbled together and the obvious lack of cover for the men, I am not sure that I myself would have pressed on. But as this craft turned away, it presented its flank to the 88mm guns and it was shot immediately below the waterline. The explosions tore off large pieces of its side and the craft began to capsize rapidly as the water flooded in. I could see the troops inside as the hull rose up, as the whole interior of the vessel was exposed to us. There were various vehicles in that craft, jeeps and trucks as well as troops. These vehicles were falling onto the troops as the floor became almost vertical, crushing many men. Other men were jumping from the sides into the sea. The 88mm fired again into the middle of the interior and this exploded the vehicles as they lay crushed together. I saw that whole landing craft go up in flames within seconds and sink very quickly, surrounded by men struggling in the water. I thought, if many more try to turn away like that, there won't be enough Americans to replace the dead ones on the beach, and so we will win this dreadful fight. However, this feeling did not last for long, as we then came under heavier fire and tanks began to appear on the beach. These weren't amphibious tanks. I did see in the distance one single tank emerge from the sea. It was a Sherman, very recognizable. I had the impression that it was coming up from the seafloor, that is how it looked to me. It was an incredible sight. I had no idea it was even possible to make tanks travel underwater. I never heard of our forces being able to do such a thing. But this single tank was on its own and it was fired on by pack guns further down the beach and stopped instantly. After that, I saw a very large landing craft approach several hundred meters away and as it lowered its ramp I saw a Sherman tank come out and roll down into the shallows. This tank had some kind of screen or tubing around it and it traveled slowly but effectively through the shallows and onto the sand. It immediately began firing up at the resistance points on the cliffs. Other tanks came out of the craft behind it, I am not sure how many but there were several. At the same time, we began receiving very accurate mortar fire onto our position. So the moment when I thought that we might win was very brief. My memory of the closing phases of that battle are rather disjointed. My position was struck by mortar fire, which I think was coming from a mortar setup in a crater along the beach. These rounds were small caliber but they produced a lot of splinters which flew around and ricocheted off any surface. My loader was hit in the back of the neck and he had to withdraw from the gun slit. He had a large piece of flesh hanging loose from his neck and he was bleeding very profusely. A replacement loader took over, bringing a new pair of ammunition boxes and we continued firing through the slit. But these mortar rounds made it difficult to see the targets on the beach, as they produced a lot of smoke and dust and to some extent I was firing blindly into the beach zone. I don't know if this was a deliberate smokescreen, but it certainly made us less effective in our firing. In addition, heavier caliber shells began to hit us again and I think these were tank rounds coming from the Shermans. Our position was hit by one of these, and many of the men behind me in the zigzag trenches were injured. I then saw flashes and gunfire for the first time on top of the cliffs on the other side of the ravine that we were close to. This was a terrible moment, because it suggested that the Americans on the beach had somehow climbed up and broken through onto the cliffs, or that they had airborne troops who had joined up from inland. However this had happened, the presence of Americans up among us on the cliffs was a great threat. At times when the sea wind blew the smoke aside, I also saw the use of flamethrowers up on the cliffs. There were long, very bright orange spurts of flame visible through the smoke and a strong smell of gasoline. I was terrified of flamethrowers, as my brother had told me about them from the Russian front. Therefore, when I saw through the smoke a man approaching from the sea up the beach, moving from one obstacle to another, I was alarmed to see that he seemed to be carrying a flamethrower gun and backpack. I shot him with the MG42 at once and the bullets evidently ignited the fuel tank on his back. There was a very large explosion and he disappeared completely in a fireball which went up into the air in a mushroom cloud. Both sides stopped firing for a moment, perhaps because we all saw what happened to this soldier. But then the shooting began again, more intensely than ever.